So my name's Dennis. I'm a Canadian, and I'm currently working on my PhD in quantum information. Please don't ask me questions about that. um, and yeah, I started messing around with Ethereum sometime in May, I believe. I actually wrote it off as a scam altcoin when I first read about it, but then I figured out that it wasn't. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, very good. In fact, I'm turning the volume down just a bit. So,
Okay. Um, and yeah, I've my two partners um, are Casey Coleman and Preston Byrne. Casey is a lawyer coder in the Netherlands, and Preston is just a securitization lawyer in London. It seems kind of like a weird combo, but there's a reason for all of us there. And I'm sorry that you got me. Unfortunately, the time difference makes it harder for Casey to give talks like this. Um, I'm not the well-worded one of the group, as you might guess. I think that's everything about us. So I was asked to talk about Eris and Project Douglas, which I'm not sure. It gets kind of confusing when you try and define which one was the first thing. It's all sort of a cumulative process, right? So um, this is certainly probably the largest smart contract DAO that's at least been built on Ethereum. I know of nothing else that was of this scale. Um, and for those who are not familiar, though I expect most of you are, a DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization, and though there's quite a bit of debate over what constitutes a DAO, these are the things that I sort of break it down into. Um, some people think or prefer to think of DAOs as like people who are surrounding a computer program, but I prefer to think of DAOs as computer programs that are assisting people in being an organization. So that's the viewpoint that I typically take with DAOs. Um, uh, yeah, I don't need to read that. So the reason Eris actually started was there was a bounty by Olivier Janssens. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. Um, this was early part of the summer, and he wanted a platform to replace the Bitcoin Foundation. And I had actually been working on this for many months. Sometime in November is when I had joined the Bitcoin Foundation, but I had after a month being there, I decided I would read the bylaws of the organization and realized how backwards the bylaws were and didn't reflect the intent of the organization. So I was trying to figure out a platform for many months that would support organizations like that. Even though knew the term DAO. So yeah, when he came out with the bounty, I mean, I had planned to sort of get something done by the end of summer, but it said 1 month, and I said, well, maybe I can do that if I neglect everything else. So I didn't have a life for a month and worked on this like crazy. And the requirements that he had for it was that you had to self-organize, you had to be able to make decisions, support particular projects or parts of a project directly, so features that you want to see, and advocate for things. So like it is an advocacy group, so that is an important part. Um, yeah, so our solution has 3 coding parts and 1 not code part. That's where Preston came in. Um, so Doug, C3D, and a bylaw system. These are all, I'll just talk about them one by one. So Doug, or the decentralized organization upgrade guy, he basically, it's a smart contract to start off with. It's a singular smart contract, and it sort of acts as a name registry for resources that the DAO has. So my view of a smart contract is that you have a database and a set of rules for how to interact or modify the database. So when you have things, a lot of these contracts interacting together, you either have a choice to hard code the links between them, or you can have something that can serve up the resources that is required. So Doug basically tracks names of particular resources, and then when other smart contracts want to access a resource, say, I don't know, reputation, right? Reputation would be stored in some contract, have rules of how to modify it. And if another contract needs to know about the reputation of a particular user, it would say, hey, Doug, do you know where to get the permission contract? I mean, the reputation contract. And he'd say, sure, this is the contract address. And then from there, you'd talk to the reputation contract directly. So that's what Doug is. He's sort of my creation because as I started writing larger and larger smart contract clusters, it became completely unwieldy and quite often would end up with circular dependencies, which were an absolute nightmare. So Doug was my solution to it. And it also serves as a second purpose because he allows for a DAO to change over time. And one of the key parts of an autonomous organization for me is that self-directing, which means that I don't think I'm the smartest person on the planet, and I can't possibly predict everything that an organization is going to need for all time. So a DAO is going to need to be maintained and adapt and developed. So as long as you can reference the things that you need, it doesn't matter what the specific contract that's located at Doug is. So this allows you to swap out parts and over time change the rules by which the organization runs. Of course, you need to have very high permissions in order to do this, so that's where the permissions level come in. And the reason it's incorporated in Doug and not a separate thing is because when Doug is trying to find out permissions of who can edit Doug, Doug needs to be able to know where to find the permissions of who can edit Doug. So you end up going in circles if you try and separate it, which I did for a couple days. And the last thing about Doug is that he acts as a central point of reference for a DAO or a DApp. So he's a contract address that you can go to, and you can hand this out like a website address, and he'll be able to get you everything you need. So that's Doug. The second component is C3D. So this is mostly Casey's work, but I helped with integrating it with the rest of the systems. C3D stands, it's really CCCD, Contract Controlled Constant Distribution, which is basically a swarm implementation, and not swarm as in that Joel Dietz money thingy, which I don't really understand, but like swarm as in decentralized resource and file hosting and stuff like that. So the way that it works is it's really simple. You just Ethereum smart contracts have an amount of storage in them. If anyone here has messed around with them, so you can store a certain amount of information in a smart contract. You don't want to store entire files in the smart contract because blockchain bloat, death of the universe. So instead, we store a BitTorrent info hash and some other useful information, and then you read that out of the smart contract using some sort of standardized method, which we came up with a template for how to store this stuff and how to read this stuff. And then it throws into a torrent client and downloads it from your peers. And this allows you to have like larger amounts of content that the DAO doesn't need to know about the precise nature of the content, but it's helpful to like things like posts on a forum, which will become relevant. So you don't need to, the DAO doesn't need to know about what you said exactly. It just needs to be able to get the stuff for other people. So that's what C3D does. I'm not 100% happy with this, but it does for now. There's some other systems out there that I'm watching, but they're not quite developed yet, which would make for a good continuation of this project. And then the final part is a system of bylaws. So the bylaws are sort of grand rules about how people may interact with the DAO. Anything that you want to do with the DAO basically goes through a bylaw, and then the bylaw contracts have the permission to edit all the databases that are relevant. And so Doug tracks the bylaws, he tracks the permissions of the bylaws, etc. There's a couple important things about the bylaws. Most important is that you can only ever write them as granting abilities and not as restricting abilities. So, like I have written here, you can't say user A can't post. You say, unless you're user A, you can post. It's a subtle difference, but it's very important because you have to, basically, the way that the contracts are written, it will search and say, do you satisfy these criteria? If so, then you may do this. You can't say it the opposite way, so it's just a minor logic thing. Another more important thing is that lawyers tend to like to say, pursuant to this law and the exception of this thing, and it's all very wordy, but it's basically modifying rules that already exist with other rules on rules, and you can't do that because basically the bylaws are functions, and you apply them to the state of the DAO and it modifies it. You can't say now change the function and now apply it. You might be able to do that in more advanced languages, but not in the smart contracts, at least not right now. So yeah, those are the three coding parts. And then so I'm going to tell you about what we actually did for Eris, because those are just general tools that we developed in order to build Eris, and then Eris is our actual solution for the bounty. So Eris was, in essence, a forum, and we used C3D for the distribution of posts and comments, and it tracked reputation very much sort of like a combination between Reddit and Stack Exchange, and also an RPG, because so I really love the Stack Exchange model for how they grant permissions, in that if you contribute to the community, you get more permissions, or more abilities, rather. So basically, anytime that you get rep, it's because you're doing something that benefits the community. It's a reward for doing work for free, basically. But I realized shortly in that sometimes you might not, sort of like how you wouldn't use your Reddit score to get a bank loan. Sometimes the ways that you get rep are not always relevant to the actions that you can perform. So instead, we started to branch them out so that if you did a particular type of action that fell under a certain class participation, you would advance yourself in that branch and not in the others. So like producing content, voting on issues, stuff like that, those would all be like typical citizen actions. Whereas moderation of content, like flagging posts and voting on whether or not flagged posts are really should be removed and stuff like that, because C3D will download the content basically without your permission, which is a tiny problem, and by tiny I mean massive problem. So in order to counteract that, you have moderators who can delete this and then also delete it from other people's systems. So basically mark it for deletion. There's blacklists and stuff like that. And when you see those markers, you would just delete them. And then we also had other ones planned, but scope drift and a lack of time basically prevented us from being able to do this. But they were things like not everyone is well equipped to write smart contracts to modify a DAO. So there was what we were calling the executive branch, which could actually write new smart contracts and submit them into the DAO, and there'd be a process for editing the DAO. And then there's another one which would be judicial, which was going to basically be sort of like court, where you could judge uh, things that do not happen on chain, because that's always going to be a problem. Anytime you go off chain, you basically lost your security for the most part. So that branch would have been dedicated directly to that, and we would have continued on this had we won the bounty, but we didn't. So we like this is a massive amount of work, so we just sort of said, yeah, it's okay. We can leave it there. And yeah, so basically people who have the abilities are the people who have proven themselves the best to have those abilities over time, and not by some sort of, I don't think elections are a particularly good way of indicating who should be who should be in charge. So this is sort of the alternative that is more in line with my beliefs of this sort of thing. But of course, everything in Doug is completely modular, so you could switch out the reputation system if you thought that you could come up with a better one. There's a system out there called BitVote, where the amount that you can vote on something is based on how long you've been in the organization. And you might think that that's a better way to do it, so you could just switch out the component and use that instead. And then there's the real-world counterpart and issues. These are kind of hard to put in order because they're both tied together. Issues are basically people saying, I think we should discuss this, we should do this, etc. Something that's sort of actionable. And we used bubble-up consensus, as I call it, where basically anyone, and there's a star because you have to have the right amount of reputation, can raise an issue, and then by voting on issues, you endorse it, you change its viewership. So basically, even if you vote something down, you basically are saying this is something that's worth noting. It should be discussed. If you didn't care about it, you should just not vote on it. And in this way, like, it starts as a small little bubble, and then it grows until it reaches a sort of critical mass, and then it has to be like taken into account, in essence. And then that's where the other part comes in. As of right now, DAOs cannot be legal entities in any jurisdiction, which means that they can't hire people to do advocacy work. They can't they can't enter into any real-world contract, which is problematic when you want to develop an organization that has pull in the real world. So our sort of compromise with this was that we create a lightweight sort of interface to the real world, where it's basically just a board of directors in a nonprofit entity, and that can enter into contracts, and then it should base its judgments basically on what the issues are that come up by the community. So it interacts with the DAO. Legally speaking, Preston talked my ear off about this, but you can't actually force the board to obey the DAO because the board has to be unhindered in its decisions, but there are ways to balance that. So you don't, this is the last part. So you have to be able to balance the fact that the board could ignore what the community has said. Alternatively, the community could act in a way that the board cannot condone. So there were two methods of breaking up, basically. So if the community travels in a direction which the nonprofit can't endorse, they invoke Firestorm. At this point, I was running out of creative names, so these are pretty stupid, but they sound cool. So, Firestorm basically starts at Doug, and it destroys most of the structural components, but the hitch is that it takes at least 2 weeks to initiate. The reason for the 2 week waiting time is that there's a counter to Firestorm in that if the community does not feel that it's represented by the board anymore, it can choose to use Water Bucket to put out the Firestorm. Um, and what that basically does is it removes the ability of the company, the nonprofit, to to destroy the community basically. And they can do this even if Firestorm hasn't been activated. So at any time, they can basically choose to part ways. There's a certain level of consensus which is required to activate the water bucket, just so that it's something that wouldn't be on a hair trigger. It would have to be a serious consideration, not just 50%. It has to be 90% of the people who have reputation over 9,000. Um, so yeah, that's basically the balance of things. And throughout the whole thing, there's endless balancing because anytime that you have a global reputation system, you have to make sure that there are balances for people who figure out a way to exploit it. Um, that's why local reputation is better if you can do it, but it doesn't always work. Um, so yeah, that's all I have made up of slides, but I hope that gives you sort of an idea of what we did.